Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition and liftoff.
Space is big business. From satellites to tourism, the commercial space sector has been having a moment for the past few years, and African countries want in on the investments.
As the South African National Space Agency, SANSA, takes giant strides as we transform from a resource-bound nation to a knowledge-based economy, serving humanity without borders. SANSA envisions South Africa leading space science.
A new spaceport in Somalia, funded by the Turkish government, could be the latest contribution to the continent's $20 billion space sector. But will this one actually make it to launch?
Nigerians, this is the countdown to the launch of Nigeria's communication satellite. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
On today's Next Africa podcast, will space ever be the future technology investment Africa needs, or more big promises that end up fizzling out with less of a bang and more of a whimper? I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. Bruce Einhorn is a Bloomberg reporter who covers all things space, and he's joining us today alongside technology reporter Loni Prinsloo. Hello to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. So, as revealed on Bloomberg News earlier this week, the Turkish government is in talks with Somalia to build a new space facility, both for Turkey's burgeoning space program, as well as for testing ballistic missiles. Bloomberg reporter Salchan Hachoglu actually told us what's being planned based on his reporting.
Turkey has a nascent space program and needs a spaceport to be able to test fire the rockets that it's developing. They have been looking for a country close to equator, and they have decided to hold talks with Somalia, which is in advanced stage, to be able to build a spaceport and test fire rockets that they are going to send to the space. However, the other side of the story is Turkey has also a developing ballistic missile program, and they also want to use this site to test fire ballistic missiles that they are not able to test in Turkey or offshore Turkey. They need a bigger space to be able to test long-range missiles. Turkey and Somalia has a defense industry cooperation agreement. Turkey is already giving a lot to Somalia, from financial aid to building schools, providing security. And in July, both countries agreed to expand the defense cooperation between them.
Bruce, why is Africa attractive for space launches? Why are we seeing Turkey looking to Somalia, of all places, for launch sites?
Jen, there are some important geographic advantages that Africa offers for anybody who wants to launch rockets. It's helpful if you're launching a rocket into geostationary orbit. They're called geostationary because they travel in space, but they're always over the same place on the Earth. And if you're over the equator, that gives you the broadest range of coverage for your satellite. So if you can launch your rocket near the equator, then it makes it much easier to put your satellite into orbit over the equator. Another advantage to launching in, say, Somalia potentially would be that it's right along the Indian Ocean. So you can launch your rocket along the ocean, and there's quite a big distance to go in the ocean before you get to land. And so you have less reason to worry about the neighbors being upset about anything from your rocket potentially falling on them.
And Bruce, this is your beat, so you cover this day in, day out. Maybe you can tell us then a bit about some of the other proposals that we've seen similar to this, because there is some reporting out about how Djibouti was also talking about building its own spaceport. How does this compare to that plan?
The Djibouti example is a very good one because it shows just how there's potential, but also there's a lot of pitfalls. So in early 2023, a Chinese company announced that it had signed an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, with Djibouti to build a spaceport, really big facility. The investment was going to be about $1 billion. Djibouti, like Somalia, right there close to the equator. So there are some big advantages to launching from there. That deal never really got beyond the MOU phase and fizzled. So that does indicate that while we should be really interested in saying what Turkey's thinking about for Somalia, it's certainly not a done deal. We've seen before that it's possible that something gets announced and then doesn't happen.
Promise and pitfalls. That's a good way of describing it. I mean, Loni, jump in here because maybe you can talk about Africa's space industry then as a whole, because these are just two examples potentially of the growing interest really in getting a lot of African countries involved. But what have we seen from the sector up until this point?
Jen, so I would say not too many African countries are highly active. The bigger ones that we're seeing is South Africa. They are busy building out a $3 billion telescope, and that will be actually the biggest radio telescope in the world once it's done. Then in Nigeria, they do have a launching facility. In Algeria, they have a launching facility that they've inherited from the French. Altogether, there's about 11 launching facilities in Africa, but really only about 3 to 5 of those get used. Satellites, we've seen about 58 or so going into space by the bigger countries.
There's also a third spaceport in Eastern Africa that's really interesting, which is an Italian one, which was established back in the 1960s that has been used several times for launches over the years. Starting in 1967 was the first satellite launch from there, all the way through the late 1980s. Altogether, there were 20 orbital missions from launch from there. They're still operational there. It's called the Luigi Broglio Malindi Space Center in Kenya.
What a name. That example just goes to show, Bruce, that this is definitely not new to the continent by any means. And as Loni was just pointing out, there are projects that have been put in place, but if it is potentially a $20 billion industry, I mean, why haven't we seen this really take off in the way that it should on the continent?
There are a couple of reasons that things haven't really developed at the pace that maybe some people would like to see. There are some security issues in places like Somalia, in places like Djibouti. There are also issues related to technology exports. So if you have a satellite that you want to launch on a rocket, there's a good chance that you've got American technology on your satellite, American technology in your rocket. And the United States has pretty strict rules when it comes to the export of technology that has the potential to be used in missiles. So military applications, for clear reasons, are things that the United States is concerned about. And so most rockets that are launched, most satellites that go into orbit, launch from the United States, from Florida, from Cape Canaveral, or from California at Vandenberg Base. There are other places that rockets get launched. So you can launch from French Guiana, say. Chinese rockets launch from China, Russian rockets launch from Russia or from Kazakhstan. There are also some rockets that get launched from New Zealand. But by and large, with the exception of Russian and Chinese rockets, other rockets get launched from either the U.S. or from U.S. allies. And some of those countries have agreements with the United States that allow for the export of some of this restricted technology. Without that kind of permission, it's difficult to build a launch industry. And African countries at the moment just don't have it.
And stick with us, Bruce and Loni. When we come back, we'll look at the role African countries are playing in those big diplomatic battles over space exploration. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today, we're talking space and the role African countries could potentially play in the new space race. Bruce, space has, of course, as many of us know, been a battle between superpowers for decades. In the 50s and 60s, it was Russia and the US, but now China is a big rival in this whole space race. How would you describe the space diplomacy and what we're seeing right now in 2024?
As you point out, there is a big competition between the United States and China in space, and there's a role that Africa plays in that. So both the US and China want to send astronauts to the moon. People have been on the moon since the last Apollo astronauts in the early 1970s. The Americans have the Artemis program that is trying to get astronauts back to the moon within a few years. China wants to get its astronauts to the moon for the first time by the end of the decade. Longer term, the Chinese have a project that they initially launched with Russia a few years ago. They want to build a research station at the South Pole of the moon. And they're trying to get countries to sign up and say, we support that. Meanwhile, the Americans have initiative of their own. As part of the Artemis program, related to that, there's something called the Artemis Accords, which is an agreement among the United States and like-minded countries about how activity on the moon and elsewhere in space will be conducted going forward. The United States has gotten about 40 plus countries to sign up for that. Some African countries, Nigeria is one, Angola is another. I think there may be a few others. China got a later start compared to the Americans in trying to win diplomatic allies for its vision. But the Chinese have had some success. Most notably recently was Senegal signing up, saying that it was supporting this Chinese project for the lunar South Pole. So at the moment, there are about a dozen countries that have signed up for China's project, as opposed to 40 plus for the US. But there are a lot of countries in Africa. So there's a lot of opportunity for both sides to try to win support from African countries. It's important not just for what happens in space, but also for the rivalry between the two countries here on Earth.
I wonder, Lonnie, considering the space race that is going on in space and also on the ground here, I mean, what's the outlook you think for the industry as a whole on the continent, especially if you consider that investment gap that you were talking about?
Look, a lot of it is in the satellite space, and telecoms is very big in Africa. I think there's a plan to launch another 110 satellites for telecoms and ground observation and all of that. There's also a push by Rwanda. There's 54 countries in Africa, and they all follow their own route. So there isn't really like a concerted effort or a one plan. But there's definitely, as we said, there's definitely a push to do more.
And Bruce, I just wanted to finish with you on your outlook for the business of space, considering you have the newsletter titled that. What's your outlook for the next few years, especially considering what is going on the ground here on Earth? How does this play out over the next few years? What should we be watching for? And what is Africa's role in that?
I think Africa has a really big role to play in the years to come because access to space is becoming so much more affordable as we have more and more companies that are launching rockets. So the most well-known example, of course, is SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, and they're on track to launch well over 100 rockets this year. And because companies are now offering a lot more rides to space, space is becoming less expensive. Also, satellites have become much smaller. And so a lot more countries see opportunities for themselves to actually have their own satellites in space. And so there are many African countries that have already started doing that, but there are a lot of other African countries that haven't gotten there yet. So in the years ahead, there will be a lot more countries in Africa that want to establish a presence for themselves in orbit. And there will be a lot of companies in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, all around the world that want to help African countries do this.
Sounds like it could get very crowded, but still very interesting to follow. Bruce and Lonnie, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Really appreciate your insights. And you can read all the latest coverage of space on Bloomberg News. Plus, you can sign up for Bruce's Business of Space newsletter. So similar to what we are seeing on Earth, African nations clearly have an opportunity to play a role in industries traditionally dominated by global powers. But ultimately, what guides their participation in this new space race may be less about the actual race into orbit and more about their needs on the ground. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley. Don't forget to follow and review this show wherever you usually get your podcasts. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks as always for listening.